Okay. I hope everybody got my email this morning that I had decided once again to skip ahead a little bit to get us to material that is less bogged down in trying to determine the authenticity of various Baraita's various statements attributed to rabbis of prior generations, and also stuff that is actually practiced. So we're now on page 106a, paragraph 5. Okay, so the sages taught in a Baraita concerning the following verse. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Okay, that's something that should be familiar to everybody, right? Remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it. Okay, so we have a commandment to remember Shabbat and sanctify it. How do we do this? Zochrehu al hayayin. Remember it over wine through the recitation of Kiddush. Okay, so what we have here, and I've spoken many times over the past few years about two different types of mitzvot, right? That we have biblical mitzvot and rabbinic mitzvot, right? And according to this, saying Kiddush is actually a biblical mitzvah, right? I mean, there's no specific verse that says, thou shalt say Kiddush, right? But there is a verse that says, thou shalt remember Shabbat. How do you remember Shabbat? The rabbis say with wine, okay? And that's like unchallenged, right? Everybody agrees that that's the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Specifically, when they say with wine, what does that mean? By saying Kiddush, right?
Mhm.
Over wine. All right. Ainli ela bayom balayla min ayin. All right. So this teaches me that I have to say Kiddush during the day, right? Why? Why would the Gemara raise the suggestion that this only proves you have to say Kiddush during the day as opposed to during the night? Okay, because when do we say Kiddush, right? When do we say Kiddush on Shabbat? Right?
Before
How many times? Twice, right?
Yeah,
We say it twice. We say it once at night and once
it's
during the day,
day.
right? But the Gemara here raises the possibility that this biblical verse only applies to the daytime. Why would it suggest that possibility? Right? You have to read this very, very closely and very, very narrowly. Right? What does the verse say? Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. Yom, right? Remember the Sabbath day, not remember the Sabbath night, not remember the Sabbath evening, right? So maybe this is only the proof text for the daytime Kiddush, but not for the nighttime Kiddush, right? Because it says Yom HaShabbat. No, because it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it. How do we sanctify it? By saying Kiddush. right? When? At the beginning of Shabbat. Okay, so the Yom part is proof of saying Kiddush during the day. The Likadsho part is proof of saying Kiddush at night. Okay, does everybody understand? I mean, I'm not saying does everybody agree, right? It's a forced reading for sure, but you understand the point that it's making here. Okay, let's go on. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted, is it at this point that they're talking about Kiddush at night? Was there something in here that said the day I understood, but where is it saying the other Kiddush?
From this verse, at Zachor et Yom HaShabbat Likadsho.
Oh, Likadsho, okay.
Yeah, the Likadsho part. Okay.
That's Yom HaShabbat.
Right, but the Yom HaShabbat is Yom, and the Likadsho part is at night.
Okay, because it's holy. It's the holy time.
Right. In other words, really, literally, if you wanted to translate this, remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. Right? We make it holy by saying Kiddush. And therefore, we do that, right? I mean, if you're going to sanctify something, if you're going to make something holy, you don't do it after half has passed already, or more than, right? I mean, if you're saying Kiddush after shul, right? I mean, depends on when Shabbat starts and whatever, but Shabbat is more than halfway over at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're not sanctifying something more than halfway through. You're sanctifying it at the beginning. Right? So this is taken as a proof text. Again, you do not have to find this convincing at all. Right? It is clearly a rather forced reading. Right? But this is considered the proof text for why we have to say Kiddush at night and not just during the day. Okay? But then, the Gemara is going to question its own proof text, right? From where is it derived that one must recite Kiddush at night? Is this even an appropriate question, right? The essential mitzvah of Kiddush is to sanctify the day at night, as one must sanctify the beginning of the day, right? I mean, kind of what I just said. All right. And where do we derive the obligation of Kiddush at night? It says, remember the day of Shabbat, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat.
Mm-hmm.
So you're seeking a source for Kiddush at night, but you're citing a verse that refers to the day. Okay? So the Gemara answers, this is what they're saying. Remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it is a mitzvah to remember it over wine when it begins. Now it's coming back at you. I've only derived the obligation to recite the Kiddush at night. From where do I derive that one must also recite Kiddush during the day? The verse says, remember the day of Shabbat. Okay? So now essentially we're using one verse to prove two things, which as a general rule, the Gemara doesn't like, right? As a general rule, each verse comes to prove only one thing, right? But here they're using the Likadsho part to prove Kiddush at night and the Yom part to prove Kiddush during the day. Okay. So, all right. So what's the Kiddush that we say during the day, right? Bayom mai mivarech, right? During the day, what blessing does one recite, right? And Rav Yehuda said, before the meal, you bring a cup of wine and you simply recite the usual blessing over wine. Borei Pri Hagaf. Okay. Now the next part, I find the next part actually kind of cute and fun. Okay, the Gemara relates that Rav Ashi happened to come to the city of Machoza, and the sages of Machoza said to him on Shabbat day, will the master recite for us the great Kiddush, Kiddusha Rabbah? All right, the Saturday day Kiddush is called Kiddusha Rabbah, the great Kiddush. So this distinguished rabbi is visiting a different city, and they want to honor him by asking him to say Kiddush, right? So they say, will the great rabbi honor us by reciting Kedusha Rabbah? And they bring him a cup of wine, okay? So Rav Ashi says to himself, my niho Kedusha Rabbah, right? He's saying to himself, what is this great Kiddush to which they refer? What is Kedusha Rabbah? They say, Rabbi, will you honor us by leading us in Kedusha Rabbah? And he says, of course, right? He says to them, of course. And they bring him a cup of wine. And he says to himself, what the heck have I gotten myself into, right? What the heck is this Kedusha Rabbah? He has no idea what this Kedusha Rabbah is, right? But he says to himself, okay, I know it's got to begin with Borei Pri Hagaf, right? Because every Kiddush, right? I mean, if you think of the Kiddushes that we know, right, which are really two, for Friday night, right, or for festival, for Yom Tov night, for festival night, right? What's the first thing you say? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagaf, right? So he says to himself, here's what I definitely know, okay? It's got to begin with borei pri hagaf. So he says borei pri hagaf, and he lengthens it, right? He says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagaf. Right? Saying, like, are they expecting anything else, right? Mm-hmm. So he sees this one elder man leans over and starts drinking the cup of wine. So he says, the wise man has eyes in his head, right? In other words, he was trying to see if they expected anything more or not, and by stretching it out. And they didn't expect anything more. So he said, okay, this is enough. Right now, the Gemara doesn't tell us what he would have done if he had been expecting more. Right? But apparently the great Kiddush is simply Borei Pri Hagaf. Okay? Now, what's weird about this? Anybody find anything weird about this? I mean, not the story itself. The story is cute, right? But the fact that we call this the Great Kiddush, right? I mean, it
sounds like sarcasm.
It could well be. It could well be sarcasm, right? Because it's not even a Kiddush, right? No. I mean, it's just Borei Pri Hagaf. Right? It doesn't say it. I mean, you would expect if it was a Kiddush, right? If it's sanctifying the day, it would end with the phrase Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat, right? Blessed are you who sanctifiest the Sabbath, right? But it doesn't. It's just the blessing over wine. I mean, the same blessing that you would say if you're observant and you happen to have wine with dinner tonight, you would have said Borei Pri Hagaf, right? You're just calling it Borei Pri Hagaf. You're not calling it the Great Kiddush, right? But here they're calling it I mean, and this is what it's known as. I mean, this is not just a sort of like weird thing in this section of the Talmud. I mean, that's what it's called. It's called Kiddusha Rabbah. I mean, right? It's like the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire, right? The great Kiddush is neither great nor a Kiddush, really, right? Other than the fact that it is an obligation. Stan, your hand is up.
Yeah, I would say, add to that, it's only on Shabbos lunch and a festival lunch must you say Kiddush.
Right.
Otherwise, you would not necessarily have to have wine to say Kiddush over.
Right. Right. But that's all you do, right? I mean, there's nothing else. I mean, yeah. I mean, different communities have different customs, and some people say Zachor et Yom HaShabbat at the beginning, and or they sing or they say V'shamru, but the meat of the Kiddusha Rabbah is simply to say Berei Pri Hagafen. If all you do is lift up a cup of wine and say Berei Pri Hagafen and drink it, you've fulfilled your obligation. So it's a very weird. I mean, I love the story. The story is really cute, but the phrase that this is called Kiddusha Rabbah is, to me, bizarre. All right, we'll go on. Okay, so now we're going back to something that was said previously, which we didn't actually look at, but that's okay. But this is something that some of you may be familiar with as well. All right, so as stated above, the sons of Rabbi Chia say, one who did not recite Havdalah at the conclusion of Shabbat may recite Havdalah anytime over the course of the entire week, right? In other words, if you didn't say Havdalah on Saturday night, you can still say it the rest of the week. Okay, now, what you're not supposed, having said that, you're not supposed to perform malacha. You're not supposed to perform activities that are forbidden on Shabbat until you've said Havdalah, right? So if you, for whatever reason, didn't say Havdalah Saturday night, and it's like Monday, and you're like, oh, Gavalt, I didn't say Havdalah, so say it on Monday, it's fine, right? But you should not have done malacha Saturday night, Sunday, and Monday until you've said Havdalah, right? Now, the Gemara asks, until how many days of the week have passed may one still recite Havdalah? Rabbi Zera said until the fourth day of the week, Wednesday, after which it is no longer considered the same week as the previous Shabbat, right? In other words, right, so, I mean, obviously, Shabbat is the seventh day, right? Shabbat is the seventh day, but if you think about it, I mean, just as I mentioned on Shabbat, right, that the majority of meat that kosher slaughterhouses sell is treif, right? The majority of meat that kosher slaughterhouses sell is treif, because you got the whole hindquarter plus any animal that's found not to have been kosher after it was slaughtered, right? If you're saying Havdalah, you're not actually saying it on Shabbat, right? I mean, because if you're saying it on Shabbat, you're not allowed to say it, right? You say Havdalah after Shabbat is over, right? Which means already the first day of the new week, right? So the week that Shabbat falls during would be Thursday, all right, till Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So so the week of that Shabbat ends Wednesday, after which it's the week of the next Shabbat. Okay. So this is like the ruling when Rabbi Zera sat before Rav Asa, and some say it was Rav Asa who sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and he sat and said, with regard to the wordings of bills of divorce, the first day of the week and the second and third days of the week are called after Shabbat. The fourth and fifth and the eve of the day are called before Shabbat. And similarly with Havdalah. Okay, now, again, this is kind of a technical area of halakha that if you're not a rabbi, you're unlikely to have encountered it, right? But there are very, very strict rules about writing a get, a bill of divorce, very strict rules, including dating, right? So the day of the week is Barishon b'Shabbat, the first day of the Shabbat, the second day of Shabbat, etc. The week, right? It's not just simply Yom Rishon Sunday, right, or whatever. It's the day. It's the ordinal day of the week according to its proximity to Shabbat, either before or after Shabbat, and this matters because if a get is not written properly, what happens? Right? If it gets not written properly, what happens?
Well, then it's not valid.
It's not valid, right? And therefore,
No divorcement.
right, they're still married, right? Which means that if it's an improperly written get, right, and the woman subsequently marries again, she's an adulteress. Okay, if the man subsequently marries again, it's less of a problem, right? Because biblically, you can have more than one wife, right? So if it's an invalid get and he marries again, so he's got two wives, okay, not great, but it's not necessarily that big a deal, right? But if she marries again, she's an adulteress, which in theory carries the death penalty. Again, not that we have the ability to enforce it. But B, if she has a husband if she has a child from the second husband, that child is a mamzer, right? And that is a big problem because a mamzer cannot marry within the Jewish community other than to a convert or to another mamzer. All right. Within conservative Judaism, it's not an issue because the RA, the Rabbinical Assembly's sort of Supreme Court, the Joint Beit Din, has decided simply not to accept testimony that a person is a mamzer. And if there's no, right, I mean, if there's no testimony and they just will not accept the testimony, right? But in the Orthodox world, it's still a big deal. And in Israel, it's still a big deal because marriage is controlled by the Orthodox rabbinate, right? So a get has to be written absolutely correctly. And as some of you have heard me say before, right? I mean, first of all, the average rabbi is not trained in how to write a get, right? It is a specialty. Among other things, because I mean, God help you if I were to ever write your get, because it has to be written. The rules are exactly the same for writing a Torah scroll, right? It has to be written on parchment with a quill pen. with the same type of print, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But aside from the day having to be spelled correctly, the names have to be spelled correctly, okay? And therefore, like, if you have been known by a number of different names, right, all of those would be included in the get just to make sure, right? So I would be known as Chaim ben Eliyahu, Hamichune Charles, Hamichune Chuck, Hamichune Charlie, right? Because you want to cover all of the bases, right? But not only this, and this is a controversial and highly technical area of halakha. The name of the place has to be spelled correct, right? So that, some of you have heard me say this. If I were ever writing a get, I would probably call up, one of the rabbis in Rockville and say, can I borrow your library for a couple of hours, right? Because it's much easier to be sure that you're spelling Rockville correctly than to be sure that you're spelling Gaithersburg correctly, because the TH is a sound that doesn't exist in Hebrew. So is it Gaithersburg, right? I mean, so you probably shouldn't write a get in Gaithersburg, because if it's not done properly, then it's invalid. Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Yeah, Alan.
This is terrible, and I apologize for doing this. But if you wrote the get at the synagogue, you would have to put Montgomery Village, because the city limits of the city of Gaithersburg are not where the synagogue is. And I
Right.
apologize for bringing that up.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, these are the kind of things that can have historically caused splits in communities and reciprocal excommunications and all kinds of stuff. I mean, if you look into the history, right? I mean, because I mean, that's another thing. How do you determine the real name of a place? Right? I mean, how do you determine the real name of the place? And even is it Washington or is it the District of Columbia? Right? And maybe, I mean, the section where I went to school was Georgetown, Maryland, before it was part of the District of Columbia. Is it Georgetown or is it Washington? I mean, and there have quite literally been reciprocal excommunications and over this kind of stuff. Okay, which is why the smart rabbi doesn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? Because it is both complicated and serious stuff. All right, but you're absolutely correct, and so I thank you for that. I mean, oddly enough, I am generally fairly strict about saying I live in Montgomery Village and not in Gaithersburg. I mean, unless I'm writing out my address by hand, in which case I write Gaithersburg because it's shorter. But other than that, I'm generally pretty strict about saying Montgomery Village. All right. So Rav Yaakov Bar Edi said, however, one who recites Havdalah during this time period may not recite the blessing over fire. That blessing may be recited only at the conclusion of Shabbat, at the time when fire was originally created. Okay, so if you're saying Havdalah other than on Saturday night, right, you don't light the Havdalah candle and you don't say Borei Me'orei Ha'esh. You just say the other blessings. Why? Because according to this, fire was created on, well, at the beginning of the first day, right? It's not really fire, or, right? It says or mil ore ha'esh, right? Because when was light created? When was light created? Alan, you're muted.
Immediately, let there be light.
Right, let there be
Let there
light.
be
It was
light,
the
and there
first thing
was
that
light.
God said, right? Let there be light. And so that's the very beginning of the first, right? Light is the first thing that was created on the first day, which is Sunday, or, complicated for us because we consider the end of Shabbat to be Saturday night, but halachically it's really Sunday. It's the beginning of Yom Rishon, right? So that's why we use light at that time. And if we're saying it at a different time, we don't say the blessing over light. Okay. All right. So Rav Baruna said that Rav said, one who washes his hands should not recite Kiddush after washing, as this would constitute an interruption between washing and eating. Instead, he should hear Kiddush from someone else, right? So, right, you're familiar with this. And back in the before times when we had like Shabbat dinners in the shul, right? And people would wash, right? I would always remind people, I don't like to tell people what to do, but I like to tell people to respect what people do, right? And that traditionally, once you've washed your hands, you don't speak until you say hamotzi, right? So if somebody's washed their hands and you start speaking to them and they go, they're not being rude, right? You don't speak until you said hamotzi. Why? Because you've created a hefsek, right? An interruption between washing and eating, right? Because you're washing for the purpose of eating, right? So the washing and the eating should be connected, and there's nothing in between, right? So now, and if you think about it, the way most people do it is how do we handle this, right? We say Kiddush, right? We say Kiddush, and then we wash, and then we say Hamotzi, right? Now, as I understand it, I mean, I'm not German, so I don't know, but as I understand it, the German custom is actually to wash your hands, say Kiddush, and then Motzi, right? But you certainly, and what I mean, I actually like that custom because it's more efficient, it seems to me, right? And I'm a Litvak, I'm a Lithuanian Jew, but I'm a Litvak with the soul of the Yeki, right? I'm a Lithuanian Jew with the soul of a German Jew, right? And I like to move things along quickly, except my own speaking, and do it efficiently. So I actually like that custom, but it's not the general custom, right? We say Kiddush, we wash, we say Motzi. And the reason is because, and this is what the Gemara says, if you wash, then say Kiddush, and then say Motzi, you've created an interruption, and your washing is no longer connected to your saying motzi and then eating. So if you've washed already, you should listen, you should hear somebody else say kiddush instead, right? Because it's not the case that everybody has to say kiddush, right? I mean, if we have a meal in the shul, right? Either I say kiddush or the chazan says kiddush, right? It don't have to be everybody says kiddush for themselves, right? So if you hear somebody else say kiddush and then you say amen, that's good enough. You fulfilled your obligation. I'll say, but Rav Yitzhak bar Shmuel bar Marta said to them, not a lot of time has passed since Rav died, and we have already forgotten his rulings, right? Poor guy, Rav died not so long ago, right? And now we're not following what he says. He says, many times I stood before Rav and saw that sometimes he preferred bread and he would recite Kiddush over bread, right? Now you can do that. You can recite Kiddush over bread, and at other times he preferred wine and would recite Kiddush over wine. Okay, so what he's saying is that if Rav was saying Kiddush over bread, he would wash his hands, say Kiddush, say Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and eat, and the saying Kiddush is not considered an interruption. Right now, again, I know that this is sometimes hard to follow, but my question is, do you find this a convincing argument? Because I don't. Right? I mean, it seems to me if you are reciting Kiddush over bread, right? Well, then, like, obviously you have to say Kiddush and then Hamotzi and then eat, right? But if you're saying it over wine, then there's no necessity to do it in that order, right? So I find this not a particularly convincing argument, but Rav Yitzhak bar Shmuel is upset by it. Okay, but you can in fact say Kiddush over bread, right? Although generally, now what's interesting is he says Rav preferred bread. Now, my understanding, again, I'm far from an expert on this stuff, because these are not the questions that are generally people asking me. I have literally never had somebody call me or email me or whatever and say, Rabbi, can I say Kiddush over bread? Right? I mean, my understanding is that the norm is you certainly can say Kiddush over bread, but it is only done if you don't have wine. Right? If you don't have wine, then certainly the Gemara is not going to say don't say Kiddush. It's going to say Kiddush over bread. Right? But to simply do it because you prefer to say it over bread, this is not something that I've ever heard of. Okay. So Rav Huna said that Rav said, one who has tasted any food on Shabbat night may not recite Kiddush anymore that night, as one must recite Kiddush before he eats. Instead, he recites Kiddush during the day before the meal. Okay, so if you've eaten before you say Kiddush on Friday night, you have essentially blown it. You can't say Kiddush you can't say the Friday night Kiddush. You've blown it. You have failed to fulfill a biblical obligation, But, now you've gone to sleep, you've woken up, you haven't eaten, you say Kiddush during the day before the meal. Because technically, and I'm sure like few people in our congregation follow this. I'm going to say few people in our congregation even know this. But you are technically not supposed to eat bread on Shabbat before you've said Kiddush, right? If you're not supposed to, you can eat on Shabbat, but not bread, right? So if you go to like Camp Ramah or someplace like that for Shabbat morning breakfast, they will have cereal. They may have like Danish or cookies or something like that, or cake, but they won't have bread or bagels because you're not supposed to have bread before Kiddush, which means before Shul, right? So you have to say Kiddush before you eat. Okay. So Rav Chana Bar Hinana raised a dilemma before Rav Huna. If you had food at the conclusion of Shabbat before reciting Havdalah, what is the halacha whether he may recite Havdalah? He said to him, I say that one who has tasted food may still recite Havdalah. Rav Asi said one who has tasted food may not recite Havdalah. Okay, so now we've got a disagreement. You've had food, can you say Havdalah or not? The Gemara relates that Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba happened to come to the house of Rav Asi. He forgot and he tasted some food after Shabbat before Havdalah. They gave him a cup and he recited Havdalah. Later, Rav Asi's wife said to her husband, but my master does not act this way. In your opinion, 1 week before Havdalah does not recite Havdalah. He said to her, leave Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, leave him alone. He maintains in accordance with the opinion of his rabbi. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was a student of Rav who ruled that even one who has eaten may recite Havdalah. Okay, so let me try and sort of break this down, right? So this guy, right, Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba is going to the house of Rav Asi. He had some food after Shabbat before he says Havdalah. And Rav Asi nevertheless brought him a cup of wine and for him to say Havdalah. And Rav Asi's wife said, but this is not your practice. This is not the way you do things. You say that if you've eaten, you can't say Havdalah. And Rav Asi said, yeah, but this guy follows a different opinion. He's acting according to Rav, and Rav says you're allowed to do this. Okay, now, again, the halacha of the story is not of great concern to me, but what is the sort of learning of this paragraph? What is this paragraph kind of teaching us? About, let's say, proper behavior with guests.
Well, if the guest has one practice that is different, possibly, and if they're, I don't know, that the guest could do what the guest could do what he is accustomed to do.
Right, as long as he's acting on good authority, right? Which he is. He's acting the way he was taught, right? In other words, it's what I would call halachic pluralism, right? Again, I mean, the more I study Talmud, the more I am convinced that orthodoxy, the last 200 years or so, has gone off the tracks, right? Because this text preaches halachic pluralism,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the idea that there is one and only one correct way to practice Judaism is completely undermined by this text, right? This text shows that there are different traditions, and not only there are, and you could say, all right, there are different traditions. There's the correct tradition and all the wrong traditions, right? I mean,
Based
but
on,
that, what?
I said, based on the correct, but yeah, the position is which is a correct.
Right, but that's not what this is saying at
Yeah,
all.
no, I
Right? It's
agree.
saying, look, there are legitimately different traditions, and people should act according to their own tradition, and other people should respect that. Right? And that to me is the meat of this text.
Yeah.
Right? Is that Ravasi is, no, there's not, right? Yes, Mrs. Rav Asi, right? You are correct that Rav Yirmiya's practice is not my practice.
Mhm.
You are absolutely correct, but it's okay because Rav Yirmiya's practice is the practice that he was taught by his rabbi, and therefore we should allow him to do it. Yeah, Alan.
But the larger context here, and I think it's a really good one, you were taught, to respect it, to be kind to the stranger and to our guests. And that's exactly what he's doing here. This isn't his custom, but it's a custom of the guest. And
Right.
they adhere to that out of respect to the guest, so as not to
Right.
embarrass the guest.
Right.
Mhm.
For sure. But that pluralism is not unlimited. In other words, if Rav Yirmiyah said, my custom is to eat a pork chop every Friday
Well, of
night,
course, yeah, it's within the sphere.
right? It's within a sphere, right? But within the boundaries of the system, there are multiple correct practices, right? There's not only one, and especially when we're dealing with like this kind of thing. I mean, if you're dealing with, like I spoke about writing a get, okay, now there has to really be uniformity, right? Because if there's not uniformity, then there are really severe real world consequences, right? But the question of somebody saying Havdalah after he's eaten or before he's eaten, there's not such severe real world consequences, right? I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, I have to say that, and maybe it's just the older you get, the more flexible you get, right? But one of the discussions that comes up constantly in the various electronic forums for conservative rabbis is somebody shows up at my shul. How do I know that they're really Jewish before I count them in the minyan? How do I know that they're really Jewish before I give them an aliyah? And I say, who cares? I mean, there's nothing that, now look, obviously if the guy comes in, and he's wearing a Roman collar, right? Or Hare Krishna robes. If he's wearing Hare Krishna robes, he probably is Jewish. Right. But if you have like sort of clear indications that the guy is not Jewish, all right, then maybe you start asking some questions, right? But as a general rule, I mean, so you counted him in the minyan and he's not Jewish. what's the big deal, right? I mean, what happens? Is everybody going to go to hell because you said Kaddish when there were actually only 9 Jews present? Right. Now, if he's asking you to officiate at his wedding, right, then you have to investigate, right? Then you have to ask questions. But he's not asking you to officiate his wedding. He's coming to shul and he wants to be counted for a minyan, right? So the question of pluralism is also related to the question of the severity of the consequences. But yeah, Alan, you're absolutely correct. All right. Good night, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Hope to see you over the weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.